What if I told you that one of the first great moments in World Cup history belongs to the United States? Not Brazil, not Argentina, not Germany, the United States, and not in the modern era, not with Christian Pulisic, not with Landon Donovan, not with Clint Dempsey. I'm talking about 1930, the very first World Cup. A tournament so old, so raw, and so different from the one we know today that it almost feels like another sport. No global TV spectacle, no social media, no billion-dollar football machine, just teams crossing oceans, stepping onto fields in Uruguay, and trying to understand what this new tournament could become. And in the middle of that almost forgotten beginning, there was a match most people don't talk about. United States versus Paraguay. Sounds ordinary, right? That is exactly why this story is interesting. Because hidden inside this matchup is one of the strangest details in American soccer history. The United States beat Paraguay 3-0, and Bert Patenaude scored what FIFA recognizes as the first hat trick in World Cup history. Think about that for a second. Before the World Cup became the biggest football stage on earth, before Americans were arguing about whether soccer could ever truly belong in the United States, an American forward had already written one of the tournament's first legendary pages. And yet, ask most sports fans in America about Bert Patenaude, and you will probably get a blank stare. That is the weird part. The United States had a World Cup pioneer before American soccer had a national memory. So this is not just a story about one match. It is a story about a piece of football history that was sitting in plain sight for almost a century. And to understand why USA versus Paraguay matters more than it looks, we have to go back to a time when the World Cup itself was still an experiment. In 1930, the World Cup was not yet the World Cup we imagine today. It was not a month-long global festival with every camera pointed at every touch of the ball. It was not a corporate giant. It was not a perfect television product. It was not the kind of event where every teenager on the planet instantly sees every goal 5 seconds after it happens. It was smaller, rougher, stranger. The first World Cup was held in Uruguay, and only 13 teams took part. 13. Today, that sounds almost impossible. We are used to seeing the World Cup as this massive football universe, where every continent fights for a place, every group has its own drama, and every nation treats qualification like a national event. But back then, the tournament was still trying to prove that it deserved to exist. Many European countries did not make the trip. The journey to South America was long, expensive, and complicated. This was not a quick flight, a team hotel, and a polished training camp. For some teams, just getting there was already part of the battle. And that is what makes this tournament feel so fascinating. Because when you look at 1930, you are not looking at the finished product. You are looking at the prototype, the first sketch, the moment before football became the global language it is today. Uruguay was chosen as host for a reason. The country had won Olympic football gold in 1924 and 1928, and in 1930 it was also celebrating the centenary of its first constitution. So for Uruguay, this tournament was not just sport. It was national pride, political symbolism, and football identity all packed into one event. And then into this early football experiment came the United States, not as a superpower of the sport, not as a country with a massive soccer culture, not as a nation that the world expected to fear. They came almost as an outsider. And maybe that is why the story is so damn interesting. Because in a tournament dominated by South American passion and European tradition, the United States quietly became one of its first surprises. They beat Belgium, then they faced Paraguay. And on paper, this could have been just another early group match. One line in an old tournament record. A dusty result from a football world that barely resembles ours. But history has a funny way of hiding its most important clues in places people stop looking. Because that game against Paraguay did not just help push the United States toward the semifinals. It produced a moment that football would spend decades arguing about, correcting, and finally recognizing. One American forward stepped onto the field in Montevideo and did something no one had officially done before at a World Cup. But here is where the story gets even better. For years, even the record itself was not treated clearly. The name, the goals, the historical credit, all of it became part of a strange little football mystery. And at the center of that mystery was a player most people have never heard of, Bert Patenaude. Bert Patenaude was not supposed to become a World Cup myth. He was not a global superstar. He was not a player surrounded by cameras, sponsorships, documentaries, and endless debate shows. He was a young forward from Massachusetts, part of a football world that looked nothing like the one we know now. And that is what makes him fascinating. Because sometimes history does not choose the loudest name. Sometimes it chooses the player standing in the right place on the right day before anyone realizes the moment is going to matter. Patenaude was only 20 years old at the 1930 World Cup. 20. At that age, most players are still trying to prove they belong. He stepped into the first World Cup and scored against Belgium in the opening match. For days later, against Paraguay, he scored 3 more. That should have been enough to make his name permanent. But football history is messy, especially early football history. For decades, there was confusion over one of the goals in that Paraguay match. Some records credited it to Patenaude. Others gave it to his teammate Tom Flory. And because the first World Cup did not have the kind of video evidence, broadcast archives, and statistical machinery we have today, the argument stayed alive for years. Just imagine that. You score the first hat-trick in World Cup history, and the world spends decades not being completely sure it was yours. That is not just unlucky. That is painfully American soccer. A historic moment happens, but the spotlight moves somewhere else. The record exists, but the story disappears. The player becomes important, but only to the people willing to dig. Eventually, the record was corrected. FIFA officially recognized Patenaude's hat-trick in 2006, 76 years after the match. 76 years. By then, the World Cup had already become a global empire. Pelé had lifted trophies. Maradona had created football mythology. Zidane had become a legend. Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Beckham, whole generations had passed through the game. And only then did the first World Cup hat-trick finally get placed where it belonged, next to the name of Bert Patenaude, United States of America. That delay gives the story its power, because Patenaude is not just a trivia answer. He represents something bigger. The strange relationship America has always had with soccer history. The United States was there at the beginning. It had moments, it had players, it even had records, but it did not always know what to do with them. And that is the part that should bother you a little. Because if this same story belonged to Brazil, Argentina, England, or Italy, it would probably be told every 4 years with dramatic music and slow-motion footage. It would be part of the national football mythology. But in America, it became a hidden file, a name most fans never learned. A legend waiting for someone to open the drawer. And that is why Bert Patenaude matters here. Not because he makes the United States bigger than it was. Not because one hat-trick turns a country into a football empire. It does not. He matters because he proves that American soccer history is deeper than people think. Before the big stadiums, before MLS, before Pulisic, before the debates about whether the sport could ever truly break through, there was already a player in a U.S. shirt scoring 3 times on the World Cup stage against Paraguay. But instead of becoming the beginning of an American soccer empire, that moment became something stranger, a great beginning followed by a long silence. The strange thing is this: after 1930, the United States had every reason to build something bigger. A semi-final at the first World Cup. A young forward with a historic record. A result against Paraguay that belonged in football memory. But the rise never really came. While football kept growing into a global obsession, American sports culture moved in another direction. Baseball had its summer mythology. Basketball was growing fast. American football became a national ritual. Soccer stayed on the edges, played in immigrant communities, local leagues, college fields, and small pockets where people kept the game alive without much attention. And that is the key difference. For many countries, one great World Cup moment becomes fuel. It becomes posters, legends, street stories, national pride. For the United States, 1930 became more like an old photo in a drawer. You know it exists, but nobody is really showing it to the kids. And maybe that is why American soccer has always felt like it had to start over. Again and again. Every generation needed a new reason to believe, because the old reasons were never properly passed down. That is the frustration in this story. The United States did not lack history. It lacked continuity. And just when it seemed like that first chapter had completely faded, the national team produced another moment so absurd that it should have changed everything. 20 years after Paraguay, America shocked the country that believed football belonged to them. England. In 1950, the United States arrived at the World Cup with a team almost nobody expected to remember. England arrived differently. This was England's first World Cup, and the image around them was clear. Football royalty had finally entered the room. They had famous players, confidence, and a country that saw the game as part of its identity. The United States had something else. A team built from men who were not living like modern stars. Some had regular jobs. Some played in semi-professional environments. They were not treated like global athletes. They were closer to ordinary people who happened to walk into an extraordinary match. And then, in Belo Horizonte, the impossible happened. Joe Gaetjens scored. The United States beat England 1-0. Even today, that result still sounds wrong if you say it too quickly. But the most American part of the story is what came after. This should have become a national football myth immediately. It should have been repeated everywhere. It should have made names, built legends, changed the conversation. But back home, the game barely landed the way it would have in a true football country. That is the pattern again. America shocked the world, but America itself did not fully wake up. And that is why the 1950 miracle connects so perfectly to 1930. Patenaude's hat-trick showed that the United States had history. The win over England showed that the United States could produce magic. But neither moment became a movement. So while the U.S. kept misplacing its own football past, Paraguay was building something very different. Not a forgotten miracle, not a hidden record, personality, a way of playing that made bigger teams uncomfortable. While the United States kept losing pieces of its own soccer memory, Paraguay was building an identity nobody could ignore. Paraguay was never the loudest football nation in South America. That space usually belonged to Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, countries with World Cup trophies, global icons, and football myths that travel everywhere. Paraguay had to become something else. Harder to read, harder to break, harder to enjoy playing against. That is where the idea of Guerra Guarani comes in, the Guarani fighting spirit. Not just technique, not just tactics, a stubborn refusal to disappear from a match. And you can feel why that matters. Paraguay is surrounded by giants in South American football culture. If you cannot outshine them with glamour, you survive with discipline, pride, and bite. That has always made Paraguay dangerous. They do not need to look beautiful for 90 minutes. They do not need to entertain you. They need to stay close enough, long enough, until the match starts to feel uncomfortable. One set piece, one counterattack, one nervous mistake. Suddenly, the favorite has a problem. And that is why Paraguay cannot be treated as a background character in this story. Against the United States, they are not just the other team. They are the perfect opposite. America's soccer story is about trying to be seen. Paraguay's story is about making sure you cannot ignore them. And no player showed that better than the goalkeeper who refused to behave like a normal goalkeeper. If Paraguay needed one player to explain its football soul to the world, José Luis Chilavert was almost too perfect. A goalkeeper is supposed to be the last line. Calm, controlled, far from the spotlight unless something goes wrong. Chilavert did not play that role. He turned the position into a statement. He shouted, led, provoked, organized, and then, when the moment came, walked toward the ball like an outfield player. Free kicks, penalties, long-range attempts. For Paraguay, he was not just protecting the goal. He was attacking the idea that smaller football nations should stay quiet. And that is why he matters here. Because Chilavert made Paraguay feel dangerous even before the match started. You could not look at them and think, this is just a defensive team. No, this was a team with personality. A team that could annoy you, frustrate you, and then suddenly embarrass you from a set piece. For American viewers, think about how strange that image is. A goalkeeper standing over a free kick at a World Cup. Not as a joke, not as a trick, but as a real threat. That is Paraguay. They do not always win attention with glamour. They force attention through discomfort. And after Chilavert, that spirit did not disappear. It changed shape. It became less theatrical, more disciplined, more collective. And in 2010, it almost carried Paraguay further than ever before. South Africa, 2010. Paraguay did not arrive as a favorite. They were not the team everyone came to watch. They were not selling fantasy football, but they were organized, serious, difficult, exactly the kind of team that turns a tournament into a test of patience. And then they reached the quarterfinals. That alone was historic for Paraguay. But the opponent made it heavier, Spain. This was not just any Spain. This was the Spain of Xavi, Iniesta, Villa, possession, control, and that feeling that the ball belonged to them by law. Most teams against Spain looked like they were chasing shadows. Paraguay did not. They stayed in the match. They suffered, adjusted, resisted, and waited for their opening. Then came the moment. Oscar Cardozo stepped up for a penalty. One kick to shake the tournament, but Iker Casillas saved it. Minutes later, Spain had their own penalty drama. The game turned into nerves, rebounds, inches, and chaos. Eventually, David Villa scored, and Spain escaped 1-0. Escaped. That word matters, because Paraguay did not lift the trophy. They did not reach the semifinal, but they made the future world champions feel human. That is the emotional peak of Paraguay's World Cup story. Not a celebration, but a near breakthrough. And while Paraguay carried that ache, American soccer was building a different kind of emotion. Not pain, hope. For the United States, the modern soccer story needed faces. Not just results. Faces. Someone a casual fan could recognize. Someone a kid could copy in the backyard. Someone who could make soccer feel less like a foreign language and more like a national possibility. Landon Donovan became one of those faces. His stoppage-time goal against Algeria in 2010 did something statistics cannot fully explain. It gave American soccer a moment that felt instant, emotional, and shared. Not hidden in old records. Not buried in archives. Live, loud, everywhere. Then came Clint Dempsey. Different energy. Less polished. More street. Dempsey played like he had something personal to prove every time he stepped on the field. He gave the U.S. team edge, the kind of edge American fans understand immediately. And then Christian Pulisic became the symbol of the next step. Not just an American player trying to be respected abroad, but an American player carrying expectations before he was even fully grown. The nickname Captain America is heavy, maybe too heavy, but that is the point. The country kept looking for a face of the sport, and Pulisic became the one people could point to. Patenaude was the forgotten beginning. Donovan was the emotional spark. Dempsey was the attitude. Pulisic became the expectation. That is the American arc. A country not without soccer history, but always trying to turn moments into belief. And strangely, Paraguay was there again when one of those American icons had to prove that belief under pressure. Copa America Centenario, 2016. The tournament was in the United States. The stage was big. The pressure was real. And in the final group match, the U.S. needed a result against Paraguay. This was not a beautiful, easy American victory. It was tense. Clint Dempsey scored in the first half, finishing a move that gave the U.S. control of the scoreboard, but not control of the feeling. Paraguay kept pushing. The match kept tightening. Then DeAndre Yedlin received 2 yellow cards early in the second half. Just like that, the U.S. had to play with 10 men. And this is where the matchup showed its real personality. Against Paraguay, you do not just protect a lead. You have to carry it through stress. Every clearance feels heavier. Every cross feels longer in the air. Every mistake feels like it could flip the whole thing. The U.S. held on and won 1-0. That win sent them forward in the tournament, but more importantly for this story, it gave the rivalry a modern mirror. 1930 was history. 2016 was pressure. Same opponent, different century, same uncomfortable feeling. And that is why USA versus Paraguay keeps pulling us back. It is not a famous rivalry. It is not marketed like a classic. But every time it appears, It seems to reveal something about where American soccer is at that exact moment. And in 2026, that question becomes bigger than ever. Hosting a World Cup changes the weight of every touch. For the United States, 2026 is not just another tournament. It is the biggest stage American soccer has ever been given at home. And here is the tricky part. Hosting does not only bring excitement. It brings judgment. Every pass gets measured. Every star gets compared. Every empty seat, every loud crowd, every nervous mistake becomes part of a larger argument. Is soccer finally ready to take another step in America? That is a heavy question to place on a team, because players are not marketing campaigns. They are not symbols made in a boardroom. They are people trying to play under a spotlight that keeps getting brighter. But that is what makes this moment powerful. The United States has spent almost a century creating flashes. 1930, 1950, 1994, 2002, 2010. Some were remembered, some were almost lost. But 2026 is different because the country is not watching from the outside. The tournament is here. The pressure is local. The opportunity is local. The audience is local. And across the field stands Paraguay, exactly the kind of opponent that does not care about anyone's perfect storyline. They are not here to help America believe. They are here to test whether that belief is real. So now the matchup starts to look different. USA versus Paraguay is not huge because the world has always called it a rivalry. It is huge because of what is hiding underneath. One side has a soccer history that keeps getting rediscovered. The other has a football identity built on making stronger narratives uncomfortable. That is a dangerous combination, because the United States enters these moments carrying a question. Can this finally become more than potential? Paraguay enters with a different question. Can we turn someone else's pressure into our opening? That is why this match does not need old hatred or decades of headlines to matter. It has something cleaner: contrast. America wants momentum. Paraguay wants friction. America wants the story to open up. Paraguay wants to make every page harder to turn. And if you have watched football long enough, you know those are often the games that become memorable. Not because everyone expected greatness, but because the tension was sitting there quietly before kickoff. This is the thread running through the whole story. A forgotten American record. Paraguayan identity built on resistance. Modern American stars trying to carry attention. A South American team built to punish comfort. The first chapter was written long before most people were paying attention. The next one does not need permission to matter. Football history is not always where the spotlight tells you to look. Sometimes it is not in the biggest rivalry, not in the loudest headline, not in the match everyone already agreed was important. Sometimes it is hiding in a game that looks ordinary until you pull the thread. USA versus Paraguay is one of those games. Pull it and you find the first World Cup. Pull it again and you find a forgotten American forward. Pull it again and you find a country still trying to connect its soccer past with its soccer future. Then you find Paraguay, stubborn, proud, uncomfortable, and never interested in being someone else's background character. That is what makes this matchup worth telling. Not because it is the most famous game in World Cup history, because it reminds us that football does not only belong to the obvious stories. It belongs to the hidden ones too. And maybe that is the real reason this match matters. For the United States, it is another chance to stop treating soccer history like a borrowed language. For Paraguay, it is another chance to remind everyone that respect is not requested. It is taken on the field. So when you see USA versus Paraguay, do not just see two flags, two lineups, and 90 minutes. See the echo, a story that started when the World Cup was still young, a story almost forgotten, a story still waiting to be finished. USA versus Paraguay is not just a game. It is a reminder that football remembers even when people do not.